What did Joseph Stalin actually do all day? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer is one of the most fascinating, chilling, and bizarre stories in all of modern history. Here was a man who controlled the largest country on earth, who commanded armies of millions, who decided with a stroke of his pen whether entire nations would live or die. His name alone was enough to make generals shake, make diplomats sweat, and make his own inner circle fear they would not survive the night. And yet, behind the walls of the Kremlin, behind layers of guards and secret police and armored cars, behind the paranoid rituals and elaborate deceptions, Joseph Stalin lived a life that was equal parts terrifying and deeply strange. He slept through the mornings while the Soviet Empire churned. He watched movies almost every single night. He hosted dinners that went on until 4 in the morning, where his guests ate and drank and laughed, not because they were happy, but because refusing to do so might get them killed. He signed death warrants by the thousands, often while sipping tea. He read constantly, obsessively, annotating books with notes ranging from scholarly observations to single-word insults scrawled in red pencil. He was a man of extraordinary intellectual energy and extraordinary moral emptiness, and understanding what he did with his days helps explain, perhaps better than anything else, exactly how the Soviet Union under his rule became both a superpower and a slaughterhouse. In this video, we are going to go inside the daily life of Joseph Stalin, from the moment he woke up until the moment he finally, reluctantly, went to sleep. We are going to look at his routines, his obsessions, his relationships, his paranoia, and the remarkable, horrifying machinery of power that kept him at the center of everything. So, without further ado, let's begin. To understand how Stalin spent his days, you first have to understand something fundamental about the man. He was nocturnal, almost pathologically so, and this single fact shaped the lives of millions of people across the Soviet Union. Stalin rarely went to bed before 3 or 4 in the morning, and on many nights he did not retire until 5 or even 6. This was not accidental. It was, in part, a deliberate strategy. By keeping his working hours in the deep of the night, Stalin ensured that his subordinates had to match his schedule, which meant that every general, every commissar, every minister, every secretary, every guard in the Soviet system had to be available at any hour of the night. The effect was a permanent state of exhausted anxiety among the Soviet elite. Nobody could relax. Nobody could plan around a predictable schedule. If Stalin phoned you at 2 in the morning, you answered. If he summoned you at midnight, you came immediately, dressed and sober, and ready to work or to face whatever he had in store for you. The uncertainty was part of the point. It kept everyone off balance, which is exactly where Stalin wanted them. He was born Joseph Yugashvili on December 18, 1878, in the small Georgian town of Gori, a place that would become famous for producing one of history's most formidable tyrants. His father, Bessarion, was a cobbler with a violent temper and a fondness for alcohol, and the relationship between father and son was defined by beatings and fear from Stalin's earliest years. His mother, Ekaterine, called Keke, was a deeply devout woman who scrubbed floors and took in laundry to keep the family alive, and she poured her ambitions entirely into her surviving son, So-So, as she called him. 2 of her children had already died in infancy. So-So would be her redemption, and she pushed him hard toward the priesthood, enrolling him in the Tiflis Theological Seminary in 1894 when he was 15 years old. The seminary gave Stalin his voracious reading habit, his extraordinary memory, his comfort with long working hours, and his talent for organizational discipline. It also gave him a profound contempt for religion and authority, which he would spend the rest of his life expressing in ways that would have horrified his mother. By the time he was expelled from the seminary in 1899, he had already begun attending Marxist study circles, reading revolutionary literature, and developing the steel-hard ideological certainty that would carry him through decades of underground organizing, exile, imprisonment, and eventually absolute power. The years between his expulsion from the seminary and his rise to power were years of almost constant movement, hardship, and danger. Stalin was arrested 7 times by the Tsarist secret police, and he survived 7 imprisonments and escapes, including multiple stints of Siberian exile, where temperatures fell to 50 degrees below zero, and men died not from violence, but from the sheer unrelenting cold. These years shaped him in ways that are crucial to understanding his daily habits later in life. He emerged from them deeply suspicious of everyone around him, convinced that betrayal lurked in every friendship, certain that only absolute control over information and people could keep him safe. He also emerged with a conspiratorial's habits of mind, always thinking in terms of who was loyal, who could be turned, who was hiding something, and what leverage could be used against anyone who might someday become a threat. By the time Lenin brought him into the inner circle of the Bolshevik Party, Stalin had already spent 20 years being hunted, imprisoned, and exiled, and he had learned that the only way to survive was to be harder, more suspicious, and more willing to use ruthless methods than anyone around you. These were not traits he abandoned when he came to power. They intensified. Stalin consolidated his hold on the Soviet Union gradually but relentlessly throughout the 1920s, outmaneuvering rivals like Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Nikolai Bukharin with a combination of tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. By the early 1930s, he was effectively the sole dictator of the largest country on Earth, and it was in these years that his daily routine began to take on the shape it would hold for most of the rest of his life. So what did that routine actually look like? Let us start at the beginning of his day, which is to say, let us start in the late morning. Stalin typically woke between 11 in the morning and noon, sometimes even later if he had been up particularly late the night before. He was not a man who greeted the day with enthusiasm or exercise. His mornings were slow, solitary, and dominated by paperwork. The first thing he did after rising was to go through the overnight dispatches, cables, and reports that had been delivered to his quarters while he slept. These were not light reading. The Soviet security apparatus under his control generated an almost incomprehensible volume of information on a daily basis. Intelligence reports. From foreign agents, surveillance summaries on domestic officials and ordinary citizens alike, factory output numbers from across the 11 time zones of the Soviet Union, reports on crop yields and collective farm performance, updates from military commanders, transcripts of intercepted communications, denunciations from informants, and the endless bureaucratic memoranda of an empire trying to run itself through a combination of revolutionary ideology and brute terror. Stalin read much of this material himself, which was extraordinary for a head of state and says something important about both his intelligence and his pathological need for control. He did not delegate the understanding of his empire to subordinates. He wanted to know everything himself, because knowing everything was how you stayed ahead of everyone else. His reading habits were remarkable by any measure. Over the course of his life, Stalin read an estimated 20 to 30,000 books, which works out to roughly 10 to 15 books a week across several decades of intensive reading, an almost supernatural rate that requires either extraordinary discipline or an unusual mind, and Stalin had both. His personal library at his Kuntsevo dacha, the country house outside Moscow where he spent much of his later years, contained over 20,000 volumes when he died, and virtually every one of them bore the marks of his engagement. He wrote in the margins. He underlined passages. He added comments ranging from the thoughtful to the contemptuous. Books he particularly despised received annotations like fool, nonsense, haha, or simply, in red or blue pencil. Books he admired received careful analytical notes that demonstrated a genuine intellectual engagement with the text. He read history, philosophy, military theory, economics, linguistics, poetry, fiction, and biography. He was particularly drawn to the lives of great historical rulers, reading extensively about Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Napoleon and Bismarck, not so much to judge them as to learn from them. What had made them powerful? What had made them vulnerable? What mistakes had they made that he could avoid? These were the questions Stalin brought to his reading, and they shaped not just his intellectual life but his political decisions. His morning reading was interrupted by the arrival of his personal staff and the first of the day's meetings, which typically began around noon or 1 in the afternoon. Stalin worked primarily from 2 offices during his years of supreme power: his formal office in the Kremlin, which he used for official meetings and audiences, and a more informal working space in his quarters where he dealt with paperwork and held smaller, more private discussions. The Kremlin office was on the 2nd floor of the Senate building, a room of moderate size with a long conference table, several chairs, and a desk that Stalin used for document signing and reading. He was not a man who stood on ceremony in his workspace. The room had no particular grandeur. What it had was proximity to power. Outside its doors, ministers and generals waited sometimes for hours to be summoned. Being called into Stalin's office was an event that could change a man's career, his freedom, or his life, and the waiting that preceded it was designed to communicate that fact. Stalin used waiting as a weapon, forcing even his most senior subordinates to sit outside his door for hours, sometimes past midnight, not knowing whether they would be praised, demoted, arrested, or simply sent home without explanation. The psychological toll this took on the Soviet leadership was enormous, and that was entirely deliberate. The mornings and early afternoons were also when Stalin dealt with what might be called the paperwork of terror. This is not a metaphor. The Soviet system under Stalin generated an extraordinary quantity of paper that dealt directly and explicitly with the identification, investigation, arrest, trial, and execution of enemies of the state, a category so elastic under Stalin's rule that it eventually encompassed almost anyone at any level of Soviet society. Stalin personally reviewed and signed many of these documents. Lists of names to be executed were brought to him for approval, and he initialed them, sometimes in batches of hundreds or thousands. During the height of the Great Terror in 1937 and 1938, historians estimate that Stalin personally signed death warrants for somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people, which works out to roughly 150 death warrants a day at the peak. These were not distant abstractions to him. He often knew the people on the lists. He had worked with many of them. In some cases, he had shared meals with them, gone on holiday with them, trusted them with important responsibilities. He signed their death warrants anyway, and in many cases added handwritten notes suggesting methods of interrogation, requesting updates on confessions, or simply writing "arrest" or "shoot" next to a name in his distinctive red pencil. The sheer mundane routine of this process is one of the most disturbing aspects of Stalinist rule. Death was an administrative function, processed like crop reports or factory output statistics, reviewed at a desk, initialed with a pen, and filed away. What did Stalin eat during his working days? The answer to this question is more interesting than it might seem, because food was one of the primary social currencies of Stalinist politics. Stalin had relatively simple tastes in everyday food. He was Georgian, and he maintained a lifelong preference for Georgian cuisine. Lamb, bean dishes, spicy sauces, pickled vegetables, fresh herbs, and above all the wines of Georgia, which he drank in considerable quantities throughout his adult life. He also had a fondness for simple Russian foods, soup, bread, roasted meats. For his daily meals, he typically ate lightly during the day, often just bread and butter with tea or a light soup, saving his appetite for the evening's main event, which was something that shaped the lives of his inner circle almost as profoundly as his working habits. But we will get to the famous dinners in due course. For now, it is worth noting that Stalin's relationship with food was also shaped by his deep and growing paranoia about being poisoned. He never ate anything that had not been prepared under strict supervision, never accepted food from strangers, and had elaborate protocols in place to ensure that his meals were safe. His personal chef was, like everyone around him, under constant surveillance. The fear of poison would grow more acute as Stalin aged, until in his final years it had become one of the dominant anxieties of his daily existence, influencing not just what he ate, but what medical treatment he would accept, and ultimately perhaps contributing to the circumstances of his death. The afternoon hours, roughly 2 in the afternoon to 7 or 8 in the evening, were typically when Stalin met with his most senior officials, reviewed the day's major decisions with his inner circle, and received reports from the various arms of the Soviet state. These meetings were not like cabinet meetings in Western democracies, with open discussion and the possibility of disagreement. They were exercises in managing Stalin's approval, in presenting information in a way that he would find acceptable, in navigating the extraordinary minefield of his moods and prejudices. His inner circle over the years included men like Vyacheslav Molotov, his long-serving foreign minister, Lazar Kaganovich, who oversaw major industrial and infrastructure projects, Anastas Mikoyan, who handled trade and food supply, Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the NKVD secret police, Nikita Khrushchev, who served in various senior roles, including First Secretary of the Ukrainian Party, Clement Voroshilov, his old Civil War comrade who served as Commissar of Defense, and Georgy Malenkov, one of the senior figures in the party apparatus. These men were among the most powerful people in the Soviet Union. They were also terrified of the man at the center of their world. Every one of them understood that his predecessor in that seat of power had ended up dead, and every one of them spent considerable energy trying to ensure that they would not be next. The meetings themselves were governed by an elaborate set of unspoken rules that every participant understood instinctively. You did not contradict Stalin directly. You did not present information that he had not asked for and that reflected badly on a policy he had championed. You did not show weakness, but you also did not show too much initiative, because excessive ambition was as dangerous as incompetence. You did not look bored, and you did not look too interested in what your colleagues were saying, because appearing too close to any one person could be interpreted as the formation of a faction, which was one of the most dangerous things you could be accused of in Stalinist politics. You laughed at Stalin's jokes, of which he made many, because not laughing was dangerous, but you did not laugh too loudly or too long, because that was sycophantic, and he despised sycophants, at least officially. You ate and drank what was put in front of you, even if it was 3 a.m. and you had already consumed enough alcohol to fell a horse because refusing was an insult. You stayed until he dismissed you, however long that took, and you came back the next day and did it all again. This was what it meant to be in Stalin's inner circle, a permanent state of performance, of calculated self-effacement, of survival anxiety dressed up as loyalty and comradeship. One of the most important and least understood aspects of Stalin's daily routine was his relationship with information and propaganda. Stalin was not just a consumer of information. He was one of the most active architects of the information environment in Soviet history. He personally reviewed and revised Soviet propaganda, including newspaper articles, textbooks, films, and official histories. He edited the drafts of major speeches by other Soviet leaders. He rewrote sections of the official short course history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the textbook that defined official Soviet ideology for a generation, inserting passages that elevated his own role in the Bolshevik Revolution and diminished or erased the contributions of rivals and enemies. He reviewed the scripts of major films. He made detailed notes on literary manuscripts. He approved or rejected the staging of theatrical productions. He was, in the language of a later era, the ultimate content moderator of the Soviet state, and nothing of cultural or political significance was published, broadcast, or performed without at least the theoretical possibility of his personal review and approval. This was not just about ego, though ego certainly played a role. It was about control. Information was power, and Stalin understood this more thoroughly than almost anyone in history. His relationship with the arts was complex and contradictory in ways that tell us a great deal about the kind of mind he had. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and cultural engagement, and yet he used the arts primarily as instruments of political control. And the contradiction between these two aspects of his character created an atmosphere of extraordinary creativity and extraordinary terror that is unique in the history of 20th century culture. Writers, composers, filmmakers, and artists under Stalin lived in a world where a single enthusiastic phone call from the General Secretary could mean fame and safety, and a single unfavorable review in Pravda could mean arrest and death. Stalin called the poet Boris Pasternak personally, late at night, to discuss the fate of the arrested poet Osip Mandelstam, a conversation that left Pasternak confused and terrified, and Mandelstam eventually dead in a transit camp. Stalin attended performances of the opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district by Dmitri Shostakovich, and then published a furious denunciation of it in Pravda, reducing the already terrified composer to a state of nervous breakdown that lasted years. He personally intervened in the production of the film Ivan the Terrible to tell the director Sergei Eisenstein that he had depicted Ivan too sympathetically in the first part and not sympathetically enough in the second, a note that combined aesthetic criticism with implicit political threat in a way that was characteristic of everything Stalin touched. Perhaps the most famous cultural passion of Joseph Stalin's daily life was his love of cinema. This is not a minor footnote. Stalin watched films almost every single night of his adult life, and the practice of the late-night film screening became one of the defining rituals of his court. The Kremlin had its own private cinema, installed in the 1920s, and Stalin used it constantly. His dacha at Kuntsevo also had a private screening room. The routine was usually the same. After the long working day and the interminable dinner, typically somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, Stalin and whatever members of his inner circle happened to be present would retire to the screening room for the night's film. These screenings were not relaxing social occasions, they were performances. Like everything else in Stalin's presence, and his companions watched the screen with one eye on the film and the other on Stalin, trying to gauge his reactions and calibrate their own responses accordingly. If Stalin laughed, you laughed. If he fell silent, you fell silent. If he left halfway through because he was bored, you waited to see if he would return before relaxing even slightly. Stalin watched an extraordinary range of films, and his tastes were more sophisticated than his reputation might suggest. He loved westerns, particularly American ones, and had a soft spot for Charlie Chaplin comedies. He watched Soviet propaganda films with a critical eye, making detailed notes on what worked and what did not, and his notes were passed to the relevant filmmakers with the weight of absolute editorial authority. He was particularly fond of historical epics and war films, and his enthusiasm for certain films about Russian historical figures, particularly Ivan the Terrible and Alexander Nevsky, reflected his deep identification with strong, ruthless leaders who had unified Russia through force. He also used the film screenings as a kind of political seminar, discussing with his inner circle the themes and messages of what they had watched, drawing historical parallels, testing opinions. The film room was one of the few spaces where Stalin seemed to relax, at least partially, and some of the most revealing accounts of his personality come from the recollections of those who watched films with him late into the Soviet nights. The famous dinners that Stalin hosted at the Kremlin and at his Kuntsevo dacha deserve their own extended treatment, because they were among the most important and revealing events in his daily life, and because they have been described in extraordinary detail by several survivors who lived long enough to write their memoirs. These were not normal dinner parties, they were political instruments of enormous sophistication, designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously: to reward, to test, to humiliate, to bind, and to terrify, all under the guise of comradely fellowship and Georgian hospitality. Stalin's Georgian heritage was nowhere more visible than at the dinner table. He had been raised in a culture where hospitality was a sacred obligation, where the host's honour was tied to the generosity and abundance of what he offered his guests, and where drinking was both a social ritual and a form of masculine contest. He brought all of these traditions into his political dinners, but filtered them through the cold and calculating mind of a totalitarian ruler, and the result was something that his guests experienced as simultaneously festive and terrifying. The dinners typically began late, rarely before 9 or 10 in the evening, and they almost never ended before 2 or 3 in the morning. The table was always heavily loaded with food: roasted meats, fish, vegetable dishes, breads, cheeses, and always wine. Georgian wine was Stalin's particular preference, and he kept a cellar stocked with the best vintages from the Caucasus. He also drank vodka, though less than legend suggests, and he was known to water his own wine while ensuring his guests drank at full strength, a practice that gave him a significant advantage in the long evenings. Drinking was effectively mandatory at these gatherings. Stalin's toasting rituals were elaborate and inescapable. He would propose a toast, and everyone at the table was expected to drain their glass. He called on individuals to propose toasts, which was itself a test, because the toast had to be appropriately flattering without being embarrassingly sycophantic, and it had to demonstrate political loyalty without sounding like it had been rehearsed. Getting the toast wrong could earn a contemptuous smile from the host, which was the least bad outcome. Getting it right earned a nod of approval that was worth more than any formal commendation. Nikita Khrushchev, who spent years as one of Stalin's dinner companions before eventually becoming his successor and delivering the famous secret speech denouncing him in 1956, left some of the most vivid accounts of these evenings. In his memoirs, Khrushchev described how Stalin used the dinners to humiliate his subordinates, sometimes directly and sometimes through games and tests, designed to expose weakness or disloyalty. Stalin enjoyed making people dance, literally and figuratively. He sometimes put on Georgian folk music and demanded that his guests, including elderly men in their 50s and 60s, get up and perform traditional dances. He enjoyed forcing people into awkward conversations or asking them sudden, pointed questions about their work that they might not be prepared to answer fluently after several hours of heavy drinking. He watched their faces constantly, noting reactions, filing away information about who had looked nervous, who had seemed relieved, who had exchanged glances with whom. The dinner table was an intelligence-gathering operation as much as it was a social occasion. The food and drink also served a practical political purpose. Men who were drunk and exhausted and had been eating since 10 at night were not in optimal condition for clear political thinking, and Stalin knew this. By the time a particular topic of business came up, often very late in the evening, his companions were physically and mentally disadvantaged relative to their host, who had been managing his own consumption carefully throughout the meal. Important decisions were sometimes made, or at least floated, in these late-night sessions, and the informality of the setting gave them a cover of collegial consensus that more formal proceedings would not have provided. A decision that emerged from a drunken late-night conversation was somehow different from a decision taken in a formal Politburo meeting. More personal, harder to later claim ignorance of, more deeply implicating the participants in whatever had been decided. This was another layer of Stalin's genius as a political operator. He used informal settings to create binding political commitments. The seating at Stalin's table was not random, and the invitation list itself was a form of political communication. Being included in the dinner circle was a mark of favour and relative safety. You were still trusted enough to be in the inner sanctum. Being excluded was a source of intense anxiety for Soviet officials, who understood that a sudden absence from the dinner table could precede arrest, demotion, or worse. The composition of the table changed over the years as Stalin's various purges and reshuffles removed familiar faces and introduced new ones. Men who had sat at the right hand of Stalin for years suddenly disappeared from the invitation list, and their former colleagues watched them go with a mixture of relief that it was not them and dread about what it meant for their own position. Vyacheslav Molotov, one of the longest-serving members of the Inner Circle, continued to attend these dinners even after Stalin had ordered the arrest of his wife, Polina Zhemchuzhina, on trumped-up charges in 1949. Molotov abstained from voting against her arrest in the Politburo, which was the only political gesture he was capable of making, and he continued to serve his master with apparently undiminished loyalty, even as his wife sat in a labour camp. When asked about this situation years later, Molotov offered no real explanation. He had simply done what he had to do to survive. Let us now turn to another crucial element of Stalin's daily existence, his management of the secret police and the machinery of terror. This was not a peripheral activity. It was, in many ways, the central activity of Stalinist governance, and it consumed a significant portion of his daily attention and energy. The Soviet security apparatus changed names several times over the course of Stalin's rule, from the Cheka to the OGPU to the NKVD to the MGB, and eventually the MGB again. But its fundamental function remained constant: to identify, arrest, interrogate, and destroy anyone deemed to be an enemy of the Soviet state, a definition that expanded and contracted according to Stalin's current anxieties and political needs. Stalin maintained direct and personal control over this apparatus throughout his rule, communicating directly with the successive heads of the secret police, reviewing interrogation reports, approving arrest lists, and in some cases, personally directing specific operations against specific individuals. His relationship with Lavrentiy Beria, who became head of the NKVD in 1938 and remained in senior security positions until Stalin's death, was one of the most important and most disturbing in the history of Soviet politics. Beria was a man of exceptional intelligence and exceptional brutality, a native of Georgia like Stalin himself, who had risen through the regional party apparatus by a combination of genuine ability and total willingness to do whatever was required. Stalin trusted him more than almost anyone else, which in practice meant he trusted him less than he trusted anyone outside his immediate circle, but more than he was willing to trust most of the people inside it. He used Beria as an instrument of terror while keeping him under constant surveillance, aware that the man who controlled the secret police could easily turn that apparatus against his master if he felt sufficiently threatened or ambitious. The two men had a relationship that was simultaneously close and deeply adversarial, full of mutual watchfulness and mutual calculation, with Stalin always holding the ultimate advantage but never entirely relaxed about it. The NKVD reports that came to Stalin's desk were among the most important documents he reviewed each day. These were not just security summaries. They contained detailed information about the private lives, conversations, opinions, and associations of virtually everyone of significance in the Soviet Union, gathered through a network of informants, wiretaps, surveillance operations, and the systematic torture of prisoners during interrogation. Stalin read these reports carefully and used them constantly. If a general had made an offhand critical comment about a military policy to a colleague over dinner, there was a significant chance that comment would eventually find its way into a report on Stalin's desk. If a senior party official had been seen visiting someone who was subsequently arrested, that association would be noted and filed. The knowledge that everyone was being watched and that the information gathered was being reviewed by the man at the top created a culture of absolute self-censorship that extended through every level of Soviet society. People stopped writing honestly in their diaries. They stopped speaking freely even with their closest friends. They gave deliberately vague answers to even the most innocent questions. The Soviet Union under Stalin was not just a police state in the formal sense. It was a psychological environment in which the awareness of constant surveillance had internalized itself into the very way people thought and expressed themselves. Among the most chilling of Stalin's daily habits was his practice of reviewing the interrogation reports of people who had been arrested on political charges. These reports were the products of torture, systematic and prolonged, applied by NKVD interrogators who were under explicit pressure to produce confessions that matched the narrative their superiors wanted to construct. The confessions that emerged from these processes were often elaborate and detailed, accusing the prisoners of conspiring with foreign powers, plotting assassinations, engaging in wrecking and sabotage, forming anti-Soviet organizations, and committing a range of other crimes that had the common feature of being entirely fabricated. Stalin read these reports and sometimes made detailed annotations. He would circle a name mentioned in a confession and write "check," meaning that person should now also be investigated. He would note inconsistencies and demand that interrogators resolve them, not because he cared about the truth, but because a sloppy confession was useless as a legal instrument. He would sometimes express satisfaction when a particularly prominent enemy had produced a sufficiently elaborate and damning confession, or frustration when someone refused to confess or produced a confession that was too obviously coerced to be politically usable. The question of how Stalin managed his relationship with the military deserves extended treatment because it was one of the most consequential and most complicated aspects of his rule. He had a deeply ambivalent relationship with professional military competence. He needed it, he feared it, and he was perpetually suspicious of the men who possessed it. His decision to launch the Great Purge of the Red Army in 1937 and 1938, which resulted in the execution or imprisonment of roughly 35,000 Red Army officers, including 3 of its 5 marshals, 13 of its 15 army commanders, 50 of its 57 corps commanders, and 154 of its 186 division commanders, was perhaps the single most catastrophic self-inflicted wound in military history, and it was driven entirely by his paranoid conviction that the military represented a potential rival power base. The consequences were evident immediately in the catastrophic performance of the Red Army in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 and 1940, and more devastatingly in the first months of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. When German forces tore through Soviet defences that had been left without experienced and confident leadership by the purges. Stalin had gutted his own army out of fear, and the Soviet people paid for it in blood. His management of the military during the Second World War was a study in the evolution of his own understanding of what he could and could not control. In the first hours and days after the German invasion on June 22, 1941, Stalin was reportedly paralyzed with shock, retreating to his dacha at Kuntsevo and refusing to see visitors for several days, an episode that has been interpreted variously as genuine psychological collapse, strategic calculation, or some combination of the two. When he finally emerged and took formal control of the war effort, establishing himself as Supreme Commander-in-Chief on July 19, 1941, he brought to the role the same habits of mind that governed everything else he did. Obsessive attention to detail, extreme suspicion of subordinates, a tendency to micromanage at the tactical level, and a willingness to use terror as a management tool. Officers who retreated without orders were threatened with execution. Stalin issued Order No. 227 in July 1942, the famous Not One Step Back directive, which established blocking detachments tasked with shooting soldiers who retreated without authorization. The NKVD was present at every level of the military chain of command, monitoring officers for political reliability. And yet, over the course of the war, something remarkable happened. Stalin learned, he began, to trust certain military commanders more, to defer to professional military judgment on operational matters, to allow his generals the latitude to execute plans with some degree of autonomy. Men like Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Konstantin Rokossovsky were given increasing authority as the war progressed, and as Soviet military performance improved dramatically from the catastrophic lows of 1941 and 1942. By the time of the great Soviet offensives of 1944 and 1945, the Red Army was functioning with a degree of professional competence and operational sophistication that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. And part of the credit for that belongs to Stalin's gradual willingness to step back, at least partially, from the micromanagement that had cost so many lives. This was not a fundamental change in his character. It was a tactical adaptation driven by military necessity. And as soon as the war was over, the old suspicions reasserted themselves, and several of the most successful military commanders found themselves sidelined, investigated, or worse. During the war years specifically, Stalin's daily routine shifted significantly, and it is worth pausing to describe what his days looked like during the most intense period of the conflict. He moved between the Kremlin and several fortified alternative headquarters, concerned about the vulnerability of Moscow during the period when German forces were advancing toward the capital in the autumn of 1941. He worked extraordinary hours, sometimes going 48 hours without sleep during crises, reviewing operational maps, communicating with front commanders by direct telephone, receiving envoys from the Allied powers who were trying to coordinate the broader war effort. He met with Winston Churchill twice during the war, first in Moscow in August 1942 and then at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, and these meetings provide some of the most fascinating contemporary accounts of Stalin in action, because Churchill was himself a formidable political operator who had the rare advantage of meeting Stalin as an equal rather than a subordinate. Churchill's descriptions of Stalin are remarkably consistent with accounts from Soviet sources. A man of extraordinary intelligence and control, with a disconcerting capacity for absolute stillness and attention, capable of great charm and equally capable of sudden disconcerting aggression, and always watching. The Tehran Conference of November and December 1943, where Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt met for the first time as a trio, is a particularly revealing episode in Stalin's biography. It was here that the fundamental shape of the post-war world was first sketched out, and Stalin came to the negotiations with a clarity of purpose and a tactical sophistication that consistently outmaneuvered his allies. He wanted a second front in Western Europe. He wanted recognition of Soviet territorial gains in Eastern Europe. And he wanted the post-war settlement to leave the Soviet Union with the maximum possible security buffer on its western borders. He pursued all three goals with a combination of charm, bluntness, stubbornness, and occasional theatrical anger that consistently kept Roosevelt and Churchill off balance. Roosevelt in particular, who came to Tehran convinced that he could manage Stalin through personal rapport, found himself consistently out-negotiated by a man who had been operating in high-stakes political environments for 4 decades, and who had learned to read other human beings with almost frightening precision. Stalin left Tehran with most of what he wanted, and the post-war settlement at Yalta in February 1945 confirmed and extended his gains. The post-war years, roughly 1945 to 1953, represent the final and in some ways most revealing phase of Stalin's rule, and his daily life in these years took on a character that was simultaneously more powerful and more solitary than anything that had come before. He was now the unchallenged master, not just of the Soviet Union, but of a vast empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific and included satellite states across Eastern Europe. He was also, increasingly, an old man, physically deteriorating, growing more paranoid by the year, isolated in his dashes and his offices, surrounded by people who feared and flattered him, but whom he trusted less and less. The gap between the enormous formal power he possessed and the genuine human contact he experienced had never been wider, and the daily routines of his final years reflect this contradiction with painful clarity. Stalin's health in the post-war years was a closely guarded state secret, but enough has emerged from Soviet archives and from the accounts of those who observed him to construct a reasonably clear picture. He had always been robust, physically tough in the way that men who have survived years of imprisonment and Siberian exile tend to be tough, and he had maintained his health through the extraordinary stresses of the war years through sheer force of will. But by the late 1940s, the signs of deterioration were becoming unmistakable to those close to him. He complained of headaches and dizziness. His memory, while still formidable, was no longer the near-perfect instrument it had once been. His temper never even became more volatile and less predictable. He slept more, sometimes taking afternoon naps that disrupted the carefully calibrated schedules of his staff and his inner circle. His face grew puffy and his movements slower. He had suffered at least one minor stroke, possibly in 1945, and his doctors, who existed in a state of permanent terror about the consequences of giving him bad news, were not always able to provide the frank medical advice he needed. The fear of being accused of wrecking or deliberate negligence if a treatment went wrong was so great among Soviet medical professionals that Stalin effectively had worse medical care than many ordinary Soviet citizens, because no doctor wanted to take the risk of treating him aggressively and having something go wrong. His paranoia about poison intensified dramatically in the post-war years, taking on dimensions that went beyond reasonable caution into something approaching clinical obsession. He had elaborate systems in place for testing his food and drink. He kept multiple dachas and rotated between them unpredictably, partly for security reasons and partly because the unpredictability itself seemed to give him a sense of control. He rarely announced in advance where he would be sleeping on a given night. His security detail was expanded and then expanded again, until the arrangements around his personal protection were consuming an almost comical quantity of state resources. He moved in convoys of identical black ZIS limousines so that potential assassins would not know which car he was in. The routes he travelled were cleared of traffic and lined with security personnel. The dachas themselves were surrounded by multiple rings of guards, fences, and security apparatus. And yet, paradoxically, all of this protection increased rather than reduced his sense of vulnerability, because it reminded him constantly that there were threats, and the more elaborate the defences, the more vivid his imagination of what they were defending against. The dacha at Kuntsevo, known informally as the nearby dacha or blizhnaya, became the primary centre of his existence in the post-war years. It was a relatively modest structure by the standards of one of the world's most powerful men, a single-story building set in extensive grounds outside Moscow, with simple, wooden-panelled rooms and functional furniture. Stalin had personally overseen its construction and interior design in the 1930s, and it reflected his personal aesthetic preferences, functional rather than decorative, with deep sofas for late-night sessions, long dining tables, a study, packed with books, and a private cinema. He spent increasing amounts of time here rather than at the Kremlin, which had the practical effect of requiring his inner circle to come to him, sometimes at very short notice and at very inconvenient hours, reinforcing his central position in their lives and his control over their schedules. The dacha grounds included gardens where he sometimes walked, and he maintained a personal interest in horticulture that was one of the more unexpectedly human aspects of his character. He grew lemons in pots in his study. He took a particular interest in the grafting of fruit trees and had extensive correspondence with Soviet agronomists about horticultural matters. These small domestic enthusiasms coexisted with the machinery of mass murder in a way that continues to disturb historians who try to construct a coherent psychological portrait of the man. The post-war years also saw Stalin's increasing engagement with questions of Soviet ideology and culture, and some of his most extraordinary personal interventions in intellectual and artistic life date from this period. In 1946, the party launched a new ideological campaign, the Zhdanovshchina, named after Andrei Zhdanov, the Leningrad party chief who served as its public face. This campaign attacked what it described as Western formalism and cosmopolitanism in Soviet culture, targeting writers, musicians, and filmmakers who had in some cases been celebrated only months earlier. The composer Shostakovich and Sergei Prokofiev were both formally condemned. The poet Anna Akhmatova was publicly denounced in terms of extraordinary viciousness. Literary journals were closed or reorganized. Writers were expelled from the Writers' Union. The message was clear. The relative cultural relaxation of the war years, when the regime had needed to appeal to genuine Russian patriotism rather than ideological conformity, was over, and the apparatus of cultural control was back in full force. Stalin personally reviewed and in some cases personally initiated the major cultural decisions of this period. His 1950 intervention in Soviet linguistics is perhaps the most bizarre and revealing example. Linguistics was a field that might seem remote from the concerns of a political dictator, but Stalin had been a student of language all his life, had developed strong views on linguistic theory, and had been following with irritation a debate in Soviet linguistic science in which the dominant school, associated with the name of the Georgian linguist Nikolai Marr, had achieved a position of such unchallenged orthodoxy that it had become impossible to discuss alternative approaches without risking political condemnation. In June 1950, Stalin published an article in Pravda titled "Marxism and Problems of Linguistics," in which he personally demolished the Marist orthodoxy, argued for a different understanding of the relationship between language and social class, and effectively repositioned Soviet linguistic science by personal decree. The article caused an earthquake in Soviet academia. Thousands of linguists who had spent years towing the Marist line scrambled to reorient themselves. Others who had quietly disagreed but had been afraid to say so publicly now found themselves, at least temporarily, on the winning side. The episode illustrates both Stalin's genuine intellectual interests and the absurdity of a system in which questions of academic theory were resolved not by evidence and argument, but by the personal pronouncements of an aging dictator. Stalin's relationship with his family is one of the most painful and revealing dimensions of his personal life, and it had direct implications for his daily existence, particularly in the post-war years. He had been married twice, first to Ekaterina Svanidze, known as Kato, who died of typhus in 1907 and whose death, by several accounts, broke something in him permanently, and then to Nadezhda Alliluyeva, known as Nadia, who died in 1932 under circumstances that remain disputed, with the official account listing heart failure but persistent evidence suggesting suicide. He had children from both marriages. Yakov, his son from the first marriage, who was captured by the Germans in 1941 and died in a German prisoner of war camp in 1943. Vasily, his son from the second marriage, who grew up to be a Red Air Force general and a severe alcoholic, and who lived his life in the shadow of his father's name in ways that destroyed him completely. And Svetlana, his daughter from the second marriage, who survived and eventually defected to the West, and wrote 2 extraordinary memoirs about her life with her father. Svetlana Alliluyeva's accounts of her father in his final years are among the most intimate and most heartbreaking portraits we have of Stalin as a private man. She describes a figure who was increasingly lonely, increasingly cut off from genuine human contact, who spent his evenings surrounded by subordinates who were afraid of him rather than friends who cared about him. He would sometimes call her to his dacha for long evenings that had the surface quality of family visits but the underlying atmosphere of a court performance. She was expected to be cheerful and attentive, to laugh at his jokes, to show appropriate enthusiasm for the Georgian dishes and the Georgian wine, and above all not to say anything that might disturb his moods or contradict his perceptions. When she fell in love with a young Jewish man in the early 1940s, Stalin had the man arrested and sent to a labor camp. When she fell in love again with a Soviet film producer, Stalin was furious and separated them, not because he had a particular objection to the man himself, but because he resented the implication that his daughter's emotional life might be oriented towards someone other than himself. His love for her was real, Svetlana later wrote, but it was a love that expressed itself primarily as control, and it left her, like almost everyone close to him, permanently damaged. What did Stalin actually think about? The question seems almost naive given the scale of his public actions, but it is worth taking seriously because the inner life of this extraordinary and terrible man was more complex and more contradictory than his public image suggests. He thought about power, obviously, and about the threats to his power, real and imagined. He thought about history, both as an analytical subject and as a stage on which he was determined to play a defining role. He thought about Russia and the Soviet Union and the relationship between them, about whether the revolutionary project he had been part of since his youth had been fulfilled or betrayed, about what future generations would think of what he had built. He thought about enemies, which for him was almost everyone, in an endless cycle of suspicion and calculation. And he thought about death increasingly as he aged, with a mixture of dread and defiance that several people who knew him described with remarkable consistency. He knew that he had created a system that could only survive through perpetual terror, and he knew that when he was gone, the terror would lose its animating centre. He seems to have understood that his own death would be followed by a reassessment of everything he had done, and that some of what he had done would not survive that reassessment. What he could not have fully anticipated was the thoroughness and the speed with which Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation would dismantle, at least officially, the entire edifice of the Stalin cult. The final years of Stalin's daily life, from roughly 1950 to his death in March 1953, were dominated by a new and particularly ominous wave of paranoia that expressed itself in several specific political campaigns, and that was building toward what many historians believe would have been a new purge of the Soviet leadership comparable to those of the 1930s. The Leningrad Affair of 1949 and 1950, which resulted in the arrest and execution of several senior party figures associated with the Leningrad Party organization, including Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky, suggested that the old machinery of terror was fully operational and that no position, however senior, was safe. The anti-cosmopolitan campaigns of the late 1940s and early 1950s, which were directed primarily against Jewish cultural figures and intellectuals, reflected both a long-standing strand of anti-Semitism in Soviet political culture and Stalin's particular current obsessions. The arrest of a group of Jewish doctors in January 1953 on charges of plotting to murder Soviet leaders, a case that became known as the Doctors' Plot, was widely interpreted at the time as the beginning of a major new purge that might culminate in a wave of mass deportations of Soviet Jews or in a violent assault on the surviving members of the Old Guard. Members of the Politburo, including Beria, Molotov and Mikoyan, who were told privately that they were under investigation, understood that they might be approaching the end of their lives. Stalin's daily routine in these final months had taken on an increasingly reclusive character. He spent less time at the Kremlin and more time at his various dachas. He held fewer formal meetings. He issued orders and directives through intermediaries rather than in person. Those who saw him regularly noted that he seemed physically diminished. His movements were stiffer, his face more heavily lined, his famous yellow eyes cloudier and more withdrawn. He still watched his films every night, still held his late dinners with the inner circle, still read voraciously and annotated his books, still reviewed the security reports and signed the documents that kept the machinery of his empire running. But the enormous physical and mental energy that had characterized him in his prime had visibly declined, and the routine that had once expressed his will to dominate every aspect of Soviet life had begun to feel, to those who observed it closely, like habit rather than intention. The evening of February 28th into the early hours of March 1st, 1953 was, in its external details, a typical Stalin night. He had watched a film with members of his inner circle at the Kremlin cinema and then driven to Kuntsevo for what became an extended dinner that went on until approximately 5 or 6 in the morning of March 1st. His guests that evening were the 4 men who were arguably the most powerful in the Soviet Union, after Stalin himself: Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, and Khrushchev. They ate and drank and talked for hours in the usual way, with the usual mixture of forced conviviality and underlying terror, and then they left in the early morning hours as they always did. Stalin retired to his bedroom. He did not emerge the following day. His guards, trained to absolute passivity when the master wished not to be disturbed, did not check on him. It was only late in the afternoon of March 1st that a guard, responding to the unusual silence and having noticed that the lights in Stalin's rooms had not changed since the previous night, finally opened the door and found Stalin lying on the floor, conscious but unable to speak or move properly. He had suffered a massive stroke. A team of doctors was eventually summoned, but hours had passed since the stroke, and the delay was almost certainly fatal. Whether that delay was accidental or deliberate, a product of the guards' training in non-interference, or a calculated decision by members of the inner circle who knew that their own lives might depend on his not surviving, is a question that has never been definitively answered and probably never will be. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, at the age of 73. He had ruled the Soviet Union for approximately 3 decades, longer than any other leader of that state, and his rule had shaped the country and the world in ways that continue to be felt today. The Soviet victory in the Second World War, achieved at a cost of somewhere between 27 and 30 million Soviet lives, had made the USSR a global superpower and established the bipolar world order that would define international politics for the next 4 decades. The industrialization programs of the 1930s, driven by forced collectivization and the labor of tens of millions of prisoners in the Gulag system, had transformed the Soviet Union from a largely agricultural economy into an industrial power capable of sustaining the most destructive war in human history. The political and ideological system Stalin built had outlasted him by nearly 4 decades, finally collapsing in 1991 under the accumulated weight of its own contradictions and the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev. The human cost of all of this is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Historians continue to debate the precise numbers, but the most careful estimates suggest that Stalin's rule resulted in somewhere between 8 and 20 million excess deaths directly attributable to his policies. The Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, which killed somewhere between 4 and 7 million people. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, which killed approximately 700,000 and sent millions more to the Gulag. The vast system of forced labor camps that at their peak held somewhere between 1 and 2 million prisoners at any given time. The deportations of entire ethnic groups during the Second World War, and the post-war repressions that continued until his death. Add to these the military deaths attributable to his disastrous decisions in the early months of the war and to his purge of the military leadership, and the total human cost of his rule is staggering. Let us return for a moment to the specific texture of Stalin's daily working environment, because the details matter enormously in understanding how he functioned. His desk at the Kremlin was not particularly grand. It was a working desk covered in papers with a jar of pencils, an ashtray, several telephones, and whatever document he was currently reviewing. He sat in a simple chair, not a throne, and he worked with his head bowed over the material in front of him in a posture that suggested intense concentration rather than imperial display. Those who were admitted to his presence often remarked on how different the reality was from the enormous portraits and statues that dominated Soviet public life. The man in the paintings and on the posters was a figure of supernatural calm and authority, airbrushed and uniformed and gazing toward the radiant socialist future. The man at the desk was shorter than most people expected, pockmarked from a childhood bout of smallpox, with a withered left arm that had been damaged at birth and that he habitually kept close to his body. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had trained himself never to reveal more than he intended, and his eyes, described consistently as yellow or amber by those who encountered them, had an intensity that most people found deeply unsettling. The organizational systems that Stalin used to manage his paperwork were, like everything else about his rule, entirely oriented around his personal control. He didn't use a conventional filing system in which documents were organized and retrievable by category or date. He worked through stacks and piles, which his assistants maintained in a form he found intelligible, and he carried significant portions of the information he needed in his own extraordinary memory. He had a memorized knowledge of the details of Soviet economic performance, military dispositions, the biographies and vulnerabilities of thousands of officials, the contents of key policy documents, and the history of party decisions going back decades that was genuinely astonishing and that served as the foundation of his political power. You could not catch him off guard with information he did not have. You could not manipulate him by presenting carefully selected facts, because he very often had access to the same facts from different sources and noticed discrepancies. His memory was one of his most important political tools, and he used it consciously, sometimes revealing at a critical moment that he remembered something a person had said or done years earlier that the person themselves had assumed was forgotten. His use of his own archive of personal knowledge extended to his management of personnel, which was one of the most important things he did with his daily time. Stalin spent an enormous amount of energy thinking about people. Who was loyal, who was potentially disloyal, who had the skills needed for a particular task, who could be used against whom, who was becoming too powerful and needed to be cut down, who was currently underperforming and needed to be motivated by the threat of arrest or execution. The Soviet System under Stalin did not have a conventional civil service or meritocratic personnel system. Appointments were made by the nomenklatura system, which meant that all significant positions required party approval, and the most senior positions required Stalin's personal approval. He reviewed the qualifications and political records of candidates for major appointments, made notes, sometimes interviewed candidates personally, and then either approved or rejected the recommendation. This gave him an intimate knowledge of the personnel structure of the Soviet state that was almost without parallel among leaders of large political systems, and it meant that the state was, in the most literal sense, shaped in his image, because every significant appointment reflected his personal judgment. His management of the Soviet economy deserves more than passing mention, because it was one of the most consequential areas of his daily work, and one where the gap between intention and outcome was most clearly visible. Stalin had presided over the forced industrialization of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, a process that had transformed the country from a largely agricultural economy into an industrial power at a cost of extraordinary human suffering. Collectivization, the forced reorganization of peasant agriculture into collective farms, had resulted in a famine that killed millions and had fundamentally disrupted Soviet agricultural production for a generation. The industrial program, built on the labor of millions of Gulag prisoners and on the imposition of brutally difficult work norms on the urban working class, had produced spectacular headline numbers in steel, coal, and heavy industry, while leaving the consumer economy desperately underdeveloped. Stalin reviewed economic performance reports daily, and his reactions to shortfalls ranged from demanding investigations to ordering arrests. Factory managers who failed to meet production targets risked accusations of sabotage, which was itself a capital offence. The result was a pervasive incentive to falsify reports, to overstate performance, to claim success that had not been achieved, which meant that the information flowing up to Stalin about the performance of the economy was systematically corrupted by the fear of consequences that honest reporting might bring. He knew this at some level. He was not naive about the incentives his system created, but he seemed to believe that the correct response to the problem of falsified information was more surveillance and more punishment for discovered falsification, rather than a change in the incentives that produced it. This was one of the fundamental logical traps of Stalinist governance. The methods used to enforce performance were precisely the methods that prevented accurate information about performance from reaching the top. Stalin received daily economic reports that were partially or wholly fabricated, made decisions based on those reports, and then demanded to know why the decisions were not producing the results he expected, not understanding or not acknowledging that the gap between his orders and reality was built into the system he had created. This circular dynamic was one of the central sources of economic dysfunction in the Stalin era, and it was directly connected to his personal daily habits. His demand for control, his intolerance of bad news, his punishment of those who failed to meet his expectations. The management of the Soviet nationalities was another major preoccupation of Stalin's working days, and it is worth examining in some detail because his approach to national minorities revealed important aspects of his character and his political philosophy. He was himself a member of a national minority, a Georgian who had risen to the summit of a state dominated by Russians, and his relationship to Russian nationalism was genuinely complex. He used Russian nationalism as a political instrument, particularly during the Second World War, when the ideological appeal of Soviet communism was insufficient on its own to motivate the kind of sacrificial resistance that the war required. He promoted Russian national symbols, Russian military heroes of the Tsarist period, Russian Orthodox culture, all while officially maintaining the Marxist-Leninist position that nationalism was a bourgeois ideology that would eventually be superseded. He was simultaneously the leader of a multinational state that theoretically celebrated the equality of all Soviet peoples and the architect of a system of ethnic discrimination and deportation that targeted specific national groups with collective punishment for alleged disloyalty. The deportations of entire ethnic groups during the Second World War represent one of the most extraordinary and least well-known episodes of Stalinist governance, and they were decisions that Stalin made personally, with the matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized all of his major political choices. The Chechens and Ingush, more than 500,000 people, were deported from the North Caucasus to Central Asia in February 1944 on the grounds of alleged collaboration with the German occupiers, a charge that was applied collectively to an entire people regardless of individual behaviour. The Crimean Tatars, approximately 200,000 people, were deported in May 1944. The Volga Germans, the Kalmyks, the Balkars, the Karachays, and several other groups were similarly uprooted and scattered. The deportations were carried out with brutal efficiency by NKVD units under Beria's command, and they resulted in enormous mortality rates, particularly among the elderly and young children who could not survive the conditions of the transport and the resettlement. Stalin approved these operations in direct communication with Beria, reviewing plans, approving schedules, receiving completion reports. They were, from the administrative perspective of his daily work, logistics problems like the movement of industrial equipment or the allocation of railway cars. The question of Stalin's relationship with violence is one that requires careful treatment, because the popular image of him as a man who enjoyed killing is both partially true and significantly misleading. He was certainly capable of ordering killings without obvious emotional disturbance, and the scale of the killing he ordered puts him among the greatest mass murderers in history. But the evidence for the idea that he took personal pleasure in cruelty is more mixed than is sometimes suggested. What he clearly enjoyed was power, and the demonstration of power, and violence was one instrument of power among many. He used it with calculation rather than sadism, in the sense that his killings were generally directed at political objectives rather than personal emotional satisfaction. This does not make them less monstrous. A man who murders hundreds of thousands of people for rational, political reasons is not morally superior to a man who murders for pleasure, but the distinction matters for understanding how he operated, because it means that his violence was embedded in a broader political logic rather than being an end in itself. His relationship with Molotov illustrates this dynamic particularly clearly. Molotov had been Stalin's closest political associate for decades, and the two men had a genuine working relationship of mutual dependence that went back to the 1920s. Stalin trusted Molotov more than almost anyone, and Molotov served him with a consistency and loyalty that was remarkable given the dangers of the position. And yet, in the late 1940s, Stalin had Molotov's wife arrested, humiliated Molotov repeatedly at dinner parties, suggested in private to others that Molotov might be a British spy, and generally treated his oldest political associate in a way that came just short of the arrest and execution that everyone, including Molotov himself, seems to have feared was coming. Why? The most likely explanation is that Stalin had begun to regard Molotov's very reliability and competence as a potential threat. A man who had served loyally for 30 years, who knew all the secrets, who commanded genuine respect within the party, was by that very fact a potential rallying point for anyone who might want to challenge Stalin's authority. The logic of Stalinist paranoia required that everyone, however loyal, be maintained in a state of uncertainty about their own safety, because certainty was the enemy of control. Georgy Malenkov, who served as one of the most senior figures in the party secretariat and later briefly succeeded Stalin as the most powerful person in the Soviet Union after his death, was another figure who spent years navigating the treacherous currents of Stalin's favour. Malenkov had first come to Stalin's attention in the 1930s as an efficient administrator of the party apparatus, and he had risen steadily through the organization, participating in the purges of the late 1930s with sufficient enthusiasm to demonstrate his loyalty while managing to avoid the fate of those he had helped to destroy. He was a man of considerable administrative ability and very limited personal courage, and he exemplified a particular type of Stalinist survivor. Smart enough to be useful, not so ambitious as to be threatening, willing to do what was required without requiring explanations. Stalin used him for years as a reliable instrument for party management, and then, in the post-war years, began using him as a counterweight against other members of the Politburo, elevating him, then marginalizing him, then elevating him again in a rhythm that kept him permanently off balance and permanently anxious. The experience of being managed by Stalin in this way, of having your position rise and fall according to calculations you could not fully understand, was the common experience of virtually everyone in the Soviet elite. And it produced a particular kind of institutional culture, one in which the correct response to any situation was to wait and watch rather than to act independently, because independent action was the most dangerous thing you could do. Anastas Mikoyan deserves particular attention because he is in some ways the most remarkable survivor in the history of Stalinist politics. He served in senior positions in the Soviet government from the 1920s until the 1960s, surviving the purges of the 1930s, the war years, the post-war repressions, and the transition after Stalin's death, going on to serve under Khrushchev and into the Brezhnev era. He famously said of himself that he could walk in the rain between raindrops, and the description is apt. He survived by making himself useful without making himself indispensable, by maintaining genuine competence in his area of responsibility without appearing to have independent political ambitions, by being helpful to whoever was currently in the ascendant without obviously betraying whoever was currently in decline. His memoirs, which are among the most detailed accounts we have of daily life in the Stalinist court, describe the experience of those interminable late-night dinners with a vividness that captures both their surface conviviality and their underlying terror. One of the most revealing aspects of Stalin's daily life that emerges from these survivor accounts is his extraordinary attention to the physical details of the spaces in which he worked and lived. He had strong, specific preferences about furniture, about room temperatures, about lighting, about the arrangement of objects on his desk, and these preferences were maintained with obsessive consistency across his various residences. He liked rooms that were warm, much warmer than most people found comfortable, and he kept fires burning even in mild weather. He liked thick curtains that could be completely closed against the outside world. He liked sofas that were deep enough to sink into and that could support a person sleeping. He moved constantly between the several chairs and sofas in any room he occupied, never sitting in the same spot for long, which may have been a security habit from his underground years or simply a physical restlessness that he never entirely lost. He paced when he thought, walking in slow circles around his desk or along the length of a room while he worked through a problem, and his inner circle learned to interpret the pace and pattern of his walking as an indicator of his mood. The relationship between Stalin and humour is one that surprises many people who encounter it for the first time, because the popular image of Stalin does not include laughter. But in reality, he had a sense of humour that was active, frequently deployed, and deeply revealing about his character. He liked jokes, particularly jokes that combined wit with a demonstration of power, jokes that were funny partly because the audience could not fully relax while laughing. He told anecdotes with considerable skill, usually anecdotes that had a political point embedded in the entertainment. He enjoyed wordplay and appreciated clever formulations, which reflects his literary background and his lifelong engagement with language. He laughed at physical comedy, as his enthusiasm for Charlie Chaplin films demonstrates, and he could be genuinely warm and amusing in social settings, which was part of what made him so effective as a political operator. People who had just laughed with him, genuinely laughed at something genuinely funny, were less guarded than they might otherwise have been, and less guarded people were more useful to Stalin than people who maintained their defences. His humour could also be vicious in a way that combined entertainment with political message. He would make pointed jokes at the expense of specific individuals in their presence, jokes that were funny enough that the audience had to laugh, but that communicated clearly that the person being mocked was currently in disfavour. He used sarcasm expertly, deploying it with precision against arguments he wanted to dismiss or people he wanted to undermine, and he used silence as a kind of negative humour, allowing jokes that others made to fall flat by not reacting, letting the silence spread until the person who had made the joke was squirming with anxiety before finally offering a reaction that could be anything from grudging approval to contemptuous dismissal. The management of others' emotional states through the strategic deployment and withholding of laughter was, like so much else about Stalin's social behaviour, ultimately an exercise in power. He also had a fondness for practical jokes that sometimes crossed the line from amusing to genuinely cruel. He enjoyed manipulating social situations to produce embarrassment, confusion, or conflict, not necessarily because he enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, but because the reactions people showed under pressure were informative. A man who could be provoked into anger or tears by a well-placed joke was a man whose emotional responses Stalin had successfully mapped, and that information was useful. A man who maintained his composure and managed to turn a humiliation gracefully was a man who had better self-control than average, which meant he was more capable and possibly more dangerous. Even the dinner party games and the forced dancing and the compulsory toasting were, from one angle, a continuous exercise in observation and intelligence gathering, with Stalin as the researcher and his guests as the subjects of an experiment they could not opt out of. The working relationship between Stalin and his personal secretariat deserves attention, because it was through this small group of trusted aides that the enormous volume of paperwork of his rule was physically managed. His personal secretary for many years was Alexander Poskrebyshev, a small, nondescript man with no great independent political ambitions who made himself indispensable through absolute reliability and discretion. Poskrebyshev managed the flow of documents to and from Stalin's desk, maintained records of appointments and decisions, coordinated communications between Stalin and various departments of the Soviet government, and served as the gatekeeper for access to the General Secretary. He knew more about the day-to-day operations of Stalinist governance than almost anyone outside the innermost circle, and Stalin kept him close for years. In 1952, in the gathering paranoid storm of Stalin's final months, Poskrebyshev was arrested, his wife having previously been arrested and executed on unclear charges. Even the man who had managed his papers for decades was not safe. The question of what Stalin believed, in a deep sense, about the system he was running is one that historians have debated extensively and reached no consensus on. Did he believe in communism? Did he believe that what he was doing was justified by the historical goals he was pursuing? Did he understand himself as a criminal, or did he genuinely believe that his victims deserved their fates? The evidence is contradictory and incomplete, and the self-presentation of a man who spent decades constructing carefully managed public personas is not easily penetrated to find anything like authentic belief underneath. What we can say with some confidence is that he believed in power, absolutely and consistently. He believed that the Soviet Union needed to be strong, that strength required industrialization and military capacity, and that industrialization and military capacity required control, and that control required the elimination of anyone who might undermine it. Whether this chain of reasoning was genuinely believed, or was a post hoc rationalization of behavior driven by simpler motives like fear and appetite for power, is impossible to determine from the outside and may not have been entirely clear even from the inside. One of the most important things about Stalin's daily life that we have not yet fully addressed is the sheer loneliness of it. This may seem paradoxical, given that he was surrounded by people at almost all times. Guards, secretaries, ministers, generals, dinner companions, film-watching companions, family members. But the human connection that makes company genuinely sustaining rather than just anxiety-inducing requires something that Stalin's position made almost impossible: the possibility of genuine honesty. No one in Stalin's presence could speak freely, could disagree openly, could share a concern or a doubt or a moment of genuine vulnerability without the risk that it would be used against them. Stalin himself could not speak freely either, because anything he said that expressed doubt or uncertainty or weakness would be seized upon by those constantly looking for signs of vulnerability in the supreme leader. The result was that everyone in his circle performed a version of themselves, and the performances became so habitual and so complete that the performers may have lost track of where the performance ended and the person began. Stalin had made the world around him safe by making it afraid, and in doing so, he had made himself the most isolated person in it. The Soviet Union he bequeathed to his successors was a state that had been shaped at every level and in almost every detail by the habits of one man's daily existence across 3 decades of absolute power. Its paranoid security culture reflected his personal paranoia. Its culture of falsified reporting reflected his punishment of bad news. Its cult of the strong leader reflected his construction of his own public image. Its economic distortions reflected his preferences for heavy industry and his distrust of market mechanisms. Its treatment of national minorities reflected his use of collective punishment as a management tool. Its military doctrine reflected his catastrophic interventions in military personnel and strategy. Even its geography had been shaped by his daily decisions. Cities were renamed after him, then renamed again after his denunciation. Infrastructure was built according to his aesthetic preferences. The Soviet Union of 1953, for all its enormous size and power, was in a very real sense a physical, political, and cultural monument to what one man did with his days. Understanding this is, in the end, both the most important and the most disturbing thing about the question this video set out to answer. What did Joseph Stalin actually do all day? He ran an empire, he read books and watched films and ate Georgian food and drank Georgian wine and hosted terrifying dinner parties and signed death warrants and reviewed intelligence reports and personally intervened in debates about linguistics. He did all of this with extraordinary energy and extraordinary intelligence and no discernible moral restraint whatsoever. And the result of what he did with his days was the transformation of the largest country on earth and the deaths of tens of millions of people and the permanent reshaping of the 20th century's political landscape. The daily life of one man, replicated across 30 years, produced one of the great catastrophes and one of the great transformations in modern history. If there is a lesson in that, it may simply be this. What the most powerful people in the world do with their days matters enormously, and the gap between the quotidian routine and its historical consequences is far smaller than we might prefer to believe. There is one more dimension of Stalin's daily existence that deserves sustained attention before we can claim to have given a full account of what his days actually contained, and that is the remarkable, underappreciated story of his engagement with the Soviet Union's scientific and technological establishment. Stalin was not a scientist, had no formal training in any scientifics, discipline, and approached scientific questions with the same combination of genuine curiosity and political instrumentalism that he brought to everything else. But science mattered enormously to him, both as a source of military and industrial power, and as a domain where the relationship between ideological correctness and empirical truth created constant friction that required political management. His daily work in the area of science and technology ranged from the trivial to the world historically consequential, and it illustrates in concentrated form some of the most important and most damaging features of his rule. The atomic bomb program is the most obvious and most important example. Stalin had been briefed on the American nuclear program by Soviet intelligence agents, including information passed by Klaus Fuchs and other scientists at Los Alamos, and he had followed the development of the American bomb with close attention throughout the latter stages of the war. When the Americans tested the first bomb at Trinity in July 1945 and then used bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of that year, Stalin understood immediately that the strategic situation had changed fundamentally and that the Soviet Union needed its own nuclear capability as quickly as possible. He put the atomic bomb program under the personal direction of Beria, which was a deliberate choice. He wanted someone who had proven experience in managing large-scale forced labor projects and who had the authority and the ruthlessness to overcome any obstacle. He gave the program essentially unlimited resources, assigned to it some of the best scientists in the Soviet Union, and monitored its progress with close personal attention. The first Soviet nuclear test, conducted in August 1949, was one of the genuine achievements of the Stalinist state, and it was achieved partly through espionage, partly through the mobilization of Soviet scientific talent, and partly through the sheer force of political will that Stalin applied to the project through his daily attention to its progress. The contrast with the Lysenko affair is stark and deeply revealing. While Stalin was making rational, results-oriented decisions about the nuclear program, he was simultaneously supporting the fraudulent biology of Trofim Lysenko, with consequences that set Soviet genetics and agriculture back by decades. Lysenko was an agronomist who claimed to have developed revolutionary techniques for improving crop yields based on a Lamarckian theory of inheritance that contradicted the established science of genetics. His claims were largely fraudulent. His methods did not work, and the scientific mainstream, both Soviet and international, recognized this. But Lysenko's theories fit comfortably with Marxist-Leninist ideology, which was suspicious of genetic determinism as bourgeois science, and he was skilled at political manipulation, presenting his opponents as ideological enemies rather than scientific critics. Stalin found Lysenko's framework ideologically congenial, and he used the power of the state to enforce it, suppressing legitimate genetics research, having leading geneticists arrested and executed, and elevating Lysenko to a position of institutional dominance from which he could destroy the careers of any scientist who questioned his theories. The result was that Soviet agricultural science was deliberately crippled at the moment when the country most needed it to perform, and the long-term consequences for Soviet food production were severe. The contrast between the nuclear program and the genetics disaster illustrates one of the deepest contradictions of Stalinist governance. It was capable of extraordinary rationality and efficiency in domains where the political incentives supported good outcomes, and extraordinary irrationality and destructiveness in domains where ideology and power overrode empirical evidence. Stalin's relationship with the writers and artists of the Soviet Union was one of the most extensively documented aspects of his cultural engagement, and it produced some of the most extraordinary episodes of creative terror in the history of authoritarian governance. He personally maintained what amounted to a mental card index of Soviet literary and artistic figures, tracking their current political reliability, their recent output, their personal relationships, their vulnerabilities, and their potential usefulness. He called writers and composers on the telephone, sometimes in the middle of the night, with questions or observations about their work that could range from encouragement to thinly veiled threat. The calls were terrifying precisely because of their apparent informality. This was the master of the Soviet state calling you at home, speaking in the quiet, measured tones of a well-read man who had opinions about your work, and the gap between that surface civility and the underlying reality of absolute power was, itself, a form of psychological violence. Mikhail Bulgakov, the author of The Master and Margarita, one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, had a particularly fraught relationship with Stalinist cultural politics. His plays had been banned, his novel was unpublishable, and he wrote Stalin a direct personal letter in 1930, an act of remarkable courage or remarkable desperation, asking either to be allowed to emigrate or to be given work. Stalin called him on the telephone shortly after receiving the letter, a call that Bulgakov received in a state of shock and that became one of the most famous conversations in Soviet literary history. Stalin asked him if he really wanted to leave the country, suggested that perhaps he should remain, and arranged for him to get a position at the Moscow Art Theatre. It was not exactly a reprieve. Bulgakov remained under surveillance, his major work remained unpublished in his lifetime, and he died in 1940 still without knowing whether the novel he considered his masterpiece would ever reach readers. But the call itself, and the strange outcome it produced, tells us something important about Stalin's relationship with genuine creative talent. He was capable of recognizing it, of even protecting it in a limited and conditional way, while simultaneously maintaining the political apparatus that made it impossible for it to fully express itself. Anna Akhmatova, the great poet, had a different and even more devastating experience of Stalinist cultural politics. Her former husband, the poet Nikolai Gumilev, had been shot in 1921. Her son, Lev Gumilev, was arrested multiple times, spending years in the Gulag for no reason other than his family connections, and Akhmatova was repeatedly told, explicitly or by clear implication, that his safety depended on her political compliance. She wrote the poem cycle Requiem in secret, sharing it with no one, burning each copy after the people she trusted had memorized it, knowing that the discovery of the manuscript would mean death. When the poem was finally published decades later, after her death and after Stalin's, it became immediately recognized as one of the great documents of witness in 20th century literature, a testament to what the Stalinist terror had done to ordinary people, written by a woman whose daily life for years had been conducted under the threat of her son's murder. Stalin never read Requiem. He could not have, since it did not exist as a written text during his lifetime, but he was its subject, and its continued existence as a work of art and of historical testimony is, in a certain sense, one of the small victories that outlasted him. The musicians fared similarly. Sergei Prokofiev returned to the Soviet Union from the West in 1936, a decision that, in retrospect, seems almost incomprehensible, driven by a combination of homesickness and a misjudgment of the political situation. He spent the rest of his life in the Soviet Union, producing some of his greatest works, including the ballet Romeo and Juliet, the opera War and Peace, and the piano sonatas, while navigating an increasingly hostile political environment. He was formally condemned in 1948 alongside Shostakovich. which required him to produce letters of self-criticism and to spend his remaining years in a state of constrained anxiety. He died on March 5, 1953, the same day as Stalin, a coincidence that delayed his obituaries for days because the Soviet press was entirely devoted to the leader's death. Even in dying, he was overshadowed by the man who had overshadowed everything. Shostakovich lived longer and left more extensive testimony about the experience of creating music under Stalin. His memoir, published in the West under the title Testimony and compiled by the musicologist Solomon Volkov, remains controversial in its authenticity, but other sources confirm many of its key claims. He describes the experience of waiting, in the years after his first condemnation in 1936, for the knock at the door that would signal his arrest, of keeping a suitcase packed by the door because he assumed it would come eventually, of riding the elevator to and from his apartment and thinking about which floor would be the best one to die on if he jumped. He describes Stalin's telephone calls with a mixture of desperate humour and barely controlled terror. He describes the compositions he wrote as coded messages to the future, knowing that the most important things he had to say could not be said openly in the present. Whether testimony is entirely authentic or partly embellished, it captures with extraordinary vividness the daily psychological reality of artistic life under Stalin, which was a kind of permanent audition for the approval of a man whose approval meant life and whose disapproval meant death. The question of how the Soviet people at large, as opposed to the cultural elite or the political establishment, experienced Stalin in their daily lives deserves careful consideration, because the top-down picture of his regime can obscure the complexity of the relationship between ruler and ruled. Soviet public opinion about Stalin during his lifetime was shaped by the most effective propaganda machine in the modern world, which had created around his name and image a cult of personality that made genuine assessment almost impossible. But beneath the official veneration, there was a range of actual responses that recent scholarship has begun to map more carefully. There was genuine admiration, particularly among people who associated his rule with the industrialization that had lifted their families from rural poverty, or with the victory in the Second World War that had saved the country from Nazi occupation. There was strategic compliance, the performance of loyalty without underlying commitment. There was private skepticism or cynicism, maintained carefully behind a public facade of enthusiasm. And there was genuine dissent, suppressed so thoroughly that it has left relatively little historical trace, existing mainly in the accounts of those who survived the camps where dissenters were sent. The letters that ordinary Soviet citizens wrote to Stalin, millions of which have been preserved in Soviet archives and many of which have now been studied by historians, provide one of the most fascinating and poignant windows into this relationship. People wrote to Stalin about everything: to denounce neighbours, to request interventions in personal or administrative disputes, to seek justice for perceived wrongs, to praise his leadership, to report abuses by local officials, to ask for help with housing or with family members who had been arrested. Many of these letters reflect a genuinely felt connection between ordinary citizens and the supreme leader, a belief that Stalin, if he only knew about a particular injustice, would intervene to correct it. This was not entirely irrational. There were documented cases of Stalin responding to individual letters, sometimes with personal interventions that redressed specific grievances. He cultivated this image of himself as the ultimate court of appeal, the just father of the people who would correct the errors of subordinates if only informed of them, and it served his political purposes well. It placed him above the daily abuses of the system while keeping him at the centre of people's emotional lives. The experience of the Second World War, which Stalin himself called the Great Patriotic War, represents the period when the relationship between Stalin and the Soviet people was most complicated and most intense. The first months of the war, when German forces swept through Soviet territory and millions of soldiers were killed or captured, produced a crisis of legitimacy for the Stalinist state, from which it was by no means certain it would recover. The disaster was the direct product of Stalin's own decisions. His purge of the military leadership, his insistence that intelligence warnings of the German attack were provocations designed to draw the Soviet Union into a premature war, his positioning of Soviet forces in exposed forward deployments that made the German blitzkrieg even more devastating than it might otherwise have been. And yet, as the war continued, and as the Soviet military began to find its feet, as the extraordinary resilience and courage of ordinary Soviet soldiers and civilians became the decisive factor in the struggle, Stalin's role in the victory became genuine as well as constructed. His decision to remain in Moscow in October 1941, when the city seemed on the verge of falling to the Germans, was genuinely important in maintaining the morale of the defense. His mobilization of Soviet industrial capacity, moving entire factories east of the Urals to save them from German capture, and then rebuilding production at a rate that astonished Western observers, demonstrated that the organizational capacity of the Yao Soviet state could, in the right circumstances, produce extraordinary results. The victory of 1945, for all its catastrophic human cost, was real, and Stalin was its architect in a way that could not be entirely denied even by those who despised him. The post-war celebration of that victory, the Victory Day parades and the monuments and the official narratives of heroic sacrifice were another dimension of Stalin's daily work, because the management of collective memory was as important to him as the management of current events. He understood that a shared narrative of suffering and triumph was one of the most powerful sources of political legitimacy, and he worked systematically to shape that narrative in ways that maximized its usefulness to his rule. The role of the Communist Party in organizing the resistance was emphasized. The role of Stalin personally as the supreme military commander was elevated to near mythological status. The contributions of allies, particularly the United States and Britain, whose material support through Lend-Lease had been enormously important to the Soviet war effort, were minimized or denied. The catastrophic early failures that had made the victory so costly were attributed to external factors or to the treachery of arrested officers, rather than to Stalin's own decisions. The result was an official narrative of the war that was both genuinely connected to the real experience of Soviet sacrifice and systematically falsified in ways that served political purposes. And yet, and this is the aspect of Stalin's legacy that makes him one of the most difficult figures in modern history to assess, millions of people within the Soviet Union and across the world continue to admire, venerate, and in some cases actively love him during his lifetime, and for decades after his death. The Stalin cult, which he himself had helped construct and which had become one of the most elaborate personality cults in history, had succeeded in creating a genuine mass attachment to his image that went beyond compulsion and propaganda. Surveys conducted in post-Soviet Russia have consistently found that significant portions of the Russian population regard Stalin as one of the greatest leaders in Russian history, citing his role in winning the war, industrializing the country, and making the Soviet Union a superpower. This assessment, which horrifies most Western historians and many Russians as well, reflects the degree to which Stalin's legacy remains genuinely contested, and the degree to which his daily work as a ruler, whatever its human cost, produced outcomes that some people continue to regard as positive achievements. Understanding what he actually did with his days is, in this sense, not just a matter of historical curiosity. It is essential to understanding how one man working through the instruments of an authoritarian state could simultaneously cause such catastrophic suffering and such genuine, lasting transformation. To understand the full picture of Stalin's daily life, we need to spend more time examining his intellectual habits and his relationship with knowledge, because this dimension of his character is both less well known and more important than is generally appreciated. Stalin was, by the standards of his era and by almost any standard, exceptionally well read and intellectually serious. This might seem surprising given the popular image of him as a purely practical figure of brutality and political calculation, but that image is incomplete. The man who read 20 to 30,000 books, who personally intervened in debates about linguistics and genetics and literary theory, who spent hours every day with documents and dispatches and memoranda, was a man who genuinely valued intellectual engagement and who brought real intelligence to his political work. This did not make him wise. It did not redeem his crimes. But it does make him more interesting, more comprehensible, and in some ways more frightening, because it means that his decisions were not the products of ignorance or stupidity. They were the products of a formidable and deeply informed mind that had been shaped by decades of hard experience into a particular kind of ruthlessness, and that applied its considerable intellectual resources to the project of absolute control with extraordinary consistency and effectiveness. His reading habits in the post-war years, when he had more time for them, give us a particularly clear window into his mind. He reread certain texts repeatedly, particularly classical works of history and political philosophy. He was fascinated by Machiavelli, which is not surprising, and by the Stoic philosophers, which is somewhat more surprising. He read and reread the works of Marx and Lenin, not as a devotee but as a critic, looking for gaps and contradictions and places where the theoretical framework needed to be adjusted to match political reality. He read contemporary science enthusiastically, though his enthusiasm for Trofim Lysenko's fraudulent anti-genetic biology and his suppression of legitimate genetics research represents one of the most damaging intersections of his ideological rigidity and his political power. He read fiction, including both Russian classics and foreign literature, and his marginalia in literary works reveal a reader of considerable sophistication and genuine emotional response to narrative. One of the less discussed aspects of Stalin's daily intellectual life is his poetry. He had written poetry seriously in his youth, in Georgian, and several of his poems were published in Georgian literary journals in the early years of the 20th century under the pseudonym Sosilo. They were, by the accounts of Georgian literary scholars who have examined them, genuinely accomplished, formally correct, emotionally engaging, rooted in the romantic and national traditions of Georgian literature. He stopped writing poetry at some point in his early revolutionary career, and he never mentioned this early creative work in any of his public statements or private conversations. But the existence of this poetic past is another reminder of the complexity and the tragedy of what Stalin was and might have been. Here was a man who had begun his intellectual life as a seminary student and a published poet in one of the world's oldest literary traditions, who had read more widely and thought more carefully than most of his contemporaries, and who had channeled all of that intelligence and energy into the construction of a system that killed millions of people and subjected hundreds of millions more to decades of fear. The management of Stalin's personal security deserves more detailed attention than it has received, partly because it consumed so much of his daily attention, and partly because the elaborate arrangements he required reveal so much about his psychology. His security apparatus was managed by Security, the Kremlin Commandant's office, and later by the MGB's 9th Directorate, which was responsible for the protection of senior Soviet leaders. At its peak, Stalin's personal security detail numbered in the hundreds, supplemented by thousands of additional personnel who secured his various residences, his travel routes, and the perimeters of his dacha estates. He had multiple vehicles in every convoy, multiple sets of residences, and a schedule that was never communicated in advance to anyone who did not absolutely need to know. The food testing protocols required that every dish served to Stalin be tasted by a designated tester before it reached him, a requirement that was taken seriously enough that Stalin's chefs maintained careful records of which tester had cleared which dish. The wine from Georgia went through similar testing procedures, which meant that by the time it reached Stalin's glass, it had been opened, tested, and approved by at least 2 people he trusted, which is to say, 2 people he trusted slightly more than everyone else, which is not the same as trusting them. The communication systems available to Stalin were another crucial element of his daily life, because managing the Soviet Empire required constant communication with officials spread across 11 time zones and dozens of nationalities. His primary tool for long-distance communication was the high-frequency telephone, the VCHS system, which connected the Kremlin to major party, government and military officials across the country, and which was supposed to be secure, though everyone involved understood that it might not be. Stalin made extensive use of this system throughout his working days and nights, calling commanders at the front during the war, calling regional party secretaries to demand explanations for failures, calling ministers to issue instructions at any hour of the day or night. The calls were often brief and pointed, a question, a demand, a rebuke. He rarely explained his reasoning on these calls. He stated what he wanted and waited for confirmation that it would be done. The experience of receiving one of these calls was, by the accounts of those who experienced it, one of the most stressful events in a Soviet official's working life, precisely because the call could mean anything from routine business to the beginning of the end. His management of foreign affairs in the post-war years was another major component of his daily work, and it was one in which he continued to demonstrate the tactical sophistication that had served him so well at Tehran and Yalta. The early Cold War, roughly 1945 to 1953, was shaped as much by Stalin's daily decisions as by the grand strategic concepts that historians later identified as defining the period. He approved the Soviet support for communist movements in Greece, China, Korea, and elsewhere. He directed the consolidation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe through a combination of political manipulation, economic leverage, and in some cases, direct military presence. He authorized the Soviet atomic bomb program, which succeeded in producing its first test weapon in August 1949, 4 years ahead of Western intelligence estimates, and which transformed the Soviet Union into a genuine nuclear power and permanently changed the nature of the global security environment. He managed the crisis of the Berlin blockade in 1948 and 1949, which he ultimately backed down from when it became clear that the Western airlift was succeeding and that forcing the issue risked a military confrontation he was not ready for. He authorized Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea in June 1950 and then watched with apparent equanimity as the conflict escalated and then stalemated, understanding that a war that exhausted America was advantageous to Soviet interests even if it was catastrophic for the Koreans involved. What is striking about all of these foreign policy decisions, reviewed in light of what we know about his daily routines, is how thoroughly they reflected the same characteristics that governed his domestic management: the patience, the tactical flexibility, the absolute willingness to use force or the threat of force, the preference for proxies and indirection over direct confrontation, and the underlying conviction that the correlation of forces was moving in his direction and that time was on the Soviet side. He genuinely believed, or had convinced himself, that capitalism was in structural decline and that the communist world would ultimately prevail, not necessarily through military force, but through the inexorable working of historical processes that he believed Marxist analysis had correctly identified. This conviction gave him a kind of strategic patience that his Western adversaries often found frustrating and difficult to deal with. He was not in a hurry. He had outlasted his enemies before in the underground years, in the prisons and exiles, in the political battles of the 1920s, in the catastrophic early months of the war. He believed he could outlast them again. The Soviet system that Stalin managed was, from a purely organizational standpoint, one of the most complex administrative structures in human history. The USSR, at its post-war peak, encompassed 15 Union republics with a combined population of nearly 200 million people, speaking dozens of languages, practicing multiple religions, with wildly varying levels of economic development and deeply different historical and cultural traditions. Managing this empire required an administrative apparatus of extraordinary size and complexity, and Stalin sat at its center, receiving reports, issuing directives, approving appointments, and intervening personally in matters ranging from the strategic to the absurdly trivial. He once spent a significant amount of time corresponding about the appropriate design of Soviet postage stamps. He reviewed plans for the post-war reconstruction of Soviet cities with detailed personal attention to architectural decisions. He approved the specifications for the Moscow metro stations, insisting on the elaborate neo-classical style that makes them among the most beautiful subway stations in the world. He had opinions about everything, and his opinions were binding, which meant that everyone in the Soviet system was perpetually oriented toward anticipating what those opinions might be. One aspect of Stalin's daily life that is rarely discussed, but that had enormous practical importance, was his relationship with sleep. We have already noted his nocturnal schedule, but the pattern of his sleep was also notable in other ways. He apparently suffered from significant insomnia in his later years, lying awake in the dark with thoughts that his biographers have interpreted variously as guilt, anxiety, or simply the hyperactive political calculation that never entirely stopped. He began taking sleeping medication at some point in the late 1940s or early 1950s, which combined with his alcohol consumption to create a daily pharmacological situation that was not ideal for the most powerful man in the world. The quality of his sleep clearly deteriorated in his final years, which may have contributed to the emotional volatility and increased paranoia that those close to him observed with alarm. Sleep deprivation, combined with age-related cognitive changes and the fundamental insanity of the political environment he had created, produced a final phase of his rule that was, by any reasonable assessment, genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond the ordinary dangers of Stalinist politics. The Doctor's Plot, with its clear anti-Semitic dimensions and its apparent preparation of a major new purge, suggests that Stalin in his final months was capable of decisions even more catastrophic than those he had made in his prime. The impact of Stalin's daily habits on the hundreds of millions of people who lived under his rule is not just a matter of historical accounting, it is the central moral fact of his biography. Every document he initialed, every conversation he controlled, every dinner he hosted, every film he watched, every poem he annotated took place in a context created by his absolute power. And that absolute power meant that his personal quirks, preferences, anxieties, and obsessions had direct and often lethal consequences for real people. His insomnia meant that officials across the Soviet Union could not sleep either because they might be called at any hour. His love of Georgian wine meant that the Georgian wine industry received special protection and investment. His distrust of a particular general meant that general's career or his life was over. His enthusiasm for a particular architectural style meant that a generation of Soviet buildings reflected his aesthetic preferences. His paranoid conviction that Jewish doctors were plotting against him meant that hundreds of Jewish medical professionals were arrested and that millions of Soviet Jews experienced a new wave of fear and persecution. In a totalitarian system, the ruler's daily life is not private. It is political. Every habit is a policy. Every preference is a decree. The question of what it actually felt like to live under Stalin, to navigate the daily realities of his rule as an ordinary Soviet citizen or as a member of the elite, is one that has generated an extraordinary literature of memoir, testimony, and historical analysis. For ordinary citizens, the experience of Stalinist rule was shaped primarily by scarcity, surveillance, and fear. The collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s had destroyed the traditional peasant economy and created a food system that was chronically underperforming relative to the country's needs. Rationing was a permanent feature of Soviet life for most of the Stalin years. Consumer goods were scarce, housing was overcrowded, and the gap between the official ideology of socialist abundance and the daily reality of queuing for bread was a source of cognitive dissonance that Soviet citizens managed through a combination of genuine belief, strategic cynicism, and the kind of dark humor that tends to emerge in situations where open dissent is not an option. The surveillance was omnipresent and genuinely effective. Informants were everywhere, and the knowledge that anything you said might be reported meant that most people developed a careful bifurcation between their public and private selves that was exhausting to maintain and damaging to maintain indefinitely. For the elite, the experience was different in its details but similar in its essential character. The material conditions were incomparably better. Good food, good housing, access to foreign goods through special stores, privileged medical care, the use of government vehicles, and dashas. But the political anxiety was, if anything, more acute, because the elite understood better than ordinary citizens exactly how the system worked and how quickly it could turn against them. The experience of watching colleagues, friends, and mentors disappear into the NKVD machine created a psychological environment of permanent alertness and self-censorship that shaped behavior at every level. People who had been colleagues for decades discovered that they could not speak honestly to each other because either of them might be an informant, or both of them, or neither, and there was no reliable way to know. The result was a society of extreme superficial warmth and extreme deep loneliness. Everyone performed camaraderie because the alternative was suspicious isolation, but genuine trust was almost impossible to build or maintain. The rehabilitation of Stalin's reputation in parts of Russian public discourse since the collapse of the Soviet Union is one of the more troubling developments in contemporary Russian political culture, and it is directly relevant to the question of what he actually did all day. The rehabilitation narrative tends to focus on the outcomes, particularly the Soviet victory in the Second World War and the country's emergence as a superpower, while minimizing or denying the human costs. It constructs a Stalin who was a hard but necessary leader, who made difficult decisions that other men lacked the courage to make, whose methods, however harsh, were justified by the results they achieved. This narrative has obvious political uses in contemporary Russia, where it supports a vision of strong authoritarian leadership as the natural and appropriate form of Russian governance. It is also, to put it plainly, historically dishonest. The outcomes that the rehabilitation narrative celebrates were achieved at a cost that no honest accounting can justify, and the methods used to achieve them were not just harsh, but criminal, producing suffering on a scale that represents one of the great atrocities of the 20th century. Understanding what Stalin actually did all day is, among other things, a corrective to this rehabilitation narrative. When you know that he signed hundreds of death warrants over breakfast, that he used dinner parties to psychologically torment the people closest to him, that he destroyed the careers and lives of scientists who disagreed with his preferred theories, that he had his son-in-law arrested and his daughter's lover exiled, that his response to the worst military disaster in Soviet history was initially to collapse and then to arrest officers who retreated rather than to examine the strategic failures that had made retreat necessary, that he turned the last months of his life into a new wave of anti-Semitic persecution that might have culminated in mass deportations, you have a picture that is very different from the strong, wise leader of the rehabilitation narrative. You have a picture of a man whose extraordinary intelligence and political skill were deployed primarily in the service of his own power at the expense of virtually everything and everyone else. And yet the full picture requires acknowledging the contradictions. This same man read poetry in multiple languages and wrote it himself, with genuine feeling. This same man wept at the opera. This same man stayed awake for days during the worst crises of the war, working with genuine urgency and genuine care to organize the defense of his country. This same man had real, if deeply distorted, affection for his daughter and real, if catastrophically expressed, commitment to the welfare of the Soviet state as he understood it. The contradiction is not a comfortable one, and it does not resolve in favor of either a simple condemnation or a simple rehabilitation. It resolves, if it resolves at all, in the direction of something more disturbing, the recognition that enormous capacity for harm and genuine human complexity can coexist in the same person, and that the coexistence does not mitigate the harm. The children, who starved in the Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, were not less dead because the man who ordered the policies that killed them also loved Georgian poetry and wept at the opera. The officers shot on his orders during the Great Terror were not less dead because the man who signed their death warrants had genuine intellectual gifts and read more books in a week than most people read in a year. The moral weight of what Stalin did cannot be distributed among his complexities. It rests on him, entirely and permanently. The final image of Joseph Stalin's daily life is perhaps the most fitting. An old man lying on the floor of his study at Kuntsevo in the early hours of a March morning, unable to speak, unable to move, surrounded by the books he had annotated and the papers he had signed and the elaborate security apparatus he had built around himself, and no one coming to help him because everyone was too afraid. He had spent 30 years building a system in which no one could act without his permission, and in the end that system could not even call a doctor fast enough to save his life. He died as he had lived, at the center of an empire of fear, alone. His successors spent years trying to navigate the transition from Stalinism while managing his legacy, which proved to be one of the most politically treacherous tasks in Soviet history. Beria was arrested and shot within months of Stalin's death, on the instigation of the other Politburo members who feared his power and his knowledge of their secrets. Malenkov briefly held the senior position before being outmaneuvered by Khrushchev, who emerged as the dominant figure and then, in February 1956, delivered his famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, in which he denounced the crimes of the Stalin era in terms that shocked the delegates, most of whom had been complicit in those crimes to varying degrees. The speech set off a chain of consequences that Khrushchev had not fully anticipated. Unrest. In Poland and Hungary, disillusionment among communist parties worldwide, a fundamental destabilization of the ideological certainties that had held the Soviet bloc together. The attempt to reckon with Stalin's legacy had, predictably, proved as difficult and dangerous as everything else associated with the man. His daughter Svetlana, after years of increasing isolation and unhappiness in the Soviet Union, defected to the United States in 1967, arriving in Rome and then New York to a media frenzy that neither she nor the Americans were entirely prepared for. She wrote 2 memoirs, 20 letters to a friend, and Only 1 Year, both of which remain essential reading for anyone who wants to understand Stalin as a human being rather than a historical abstraction. She spent the rest of her long life moving between countries and identities, never fully at home anywhere, the survivor of an experience that had simultaneously made her famous and made it impossible for her to live normally. She died in Wisconsin in 2011 at the age of 85, still carrying the weight of her father's name and all that it entailed. His son Vasily, the Red Air Force general and alcoholic, was arrested after his father's death on charges of abusing his position and spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. He served several years in prison and was then released, but he was never able to rebuild a functional life and died in 1962 at the age of 40, destroyed by alcohol and by the impossible burden of being Stalin's son without Stalin's protection. The fate of Stalin's children, like so much else about his daily life, illuminates the ultimate human cost of the system he built. Even his own family was consumed by it, unable to escape the shadow of the man who had defined their world. The Gulag system that Stalin had built and that had been one of the primary instruments of his rule gradually contracted after his death, though it did not disappear. Millions of prisoners were released in the WHO years following 1953, many of them returning to Soviet society after years or decades of imprisonment to find their families scattered, their careers destroyed, and their health broken. The survivors of the camps brought with them stories that could not be told publicly in the Soviet Union for decades, but that gradually, through samizdat literature and eventually through the works of writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose The Gulag Archipelago became the defining literary monument to Stalinist terror, entered the broader human record. These stories of the human beings who were the raw material of Stalin's daily paperwork are the other side of the picture of his daily life. For every document he signed, there was a person behind it. For every list he initialed, there were lives. Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953, and was buried in Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square, where his embalmed body lay for 8 years until Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign resulted in its removal, to a grave near the Kremlin wall in October 1961. The decision to remove him from the mausoleum was itself a highly charged political act, the physical expression of the attempt to distance the Soviet state from the worst of his legacy while preserving the essentials of the system he had built. It was, in this sense, entirely characteristic of everything that came after him. Partial, ambivalent, shaped by political calculation rather than honest reckoning, insufficient to the scale of what it was trying to address. What did Joseph Stalin actually do all day? He read more than almost anyone in history. He watched films nearly every night. He signed death warrants over his morning tea. He hosted dinners that lasted until dawn and that terrified everyone present. He annotated books in red pencil with the word "fool." He grew lemons in pots in his study. He phoned generals in the middle of the night to demand explanations for defeats. He reviewed interrogation transcripts produced by torture. He personally edited Soviet history textbooks to expand his own role and erase his enemies. He walked in his dacha gardens among fruit trees he had personally grafted. He wept at operas. He shot his rivals. He saved his country from Nazi conquest and enslaved it himself. He was, in the final analysis, exactly what the 20th century made possible when unlimited power fell into the hands of a man of extraordinary intelligence and no moral limits whatsoever. History has not run short of such men, but it has rarely given one of them so many resources and so many years to demonstrate exactly what that combination produces. The answer, as the Soviet peoples discovered across 30 years of his rule, was transformation and catastrophe at a scale the world had rarely seen, driven by a man who went to bed every night at 5 in the morning with a book he had annotated in red pencil, surrounded by guards who were afraid to knock on his door. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the daily life of Joseph Stalin genuinely eye-opening and thought-provoking. The story of how one man organized his days and how those days shaped the history of a century is one of the most important and most disturbing stories in modern history, and we hope we have done it some justice here. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our other content on the leaders, soldiers, and events that defined World War II and the 20th century. There is always more to discover, more to understand, and more surprising truths beneath the surface of the history we think we know. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video from us. See you in the next one.